Once upon a time, in 15th century Germany, there was a thing called the Protestant Reformation. A man named Martin Luther was annoyed with how the Catholic Church was being run and wrote a list of 95 theses complaining about it, which he then nailed to a door because that's good drama. At the time, the church was a very prominent governing force in Europe and financially profited from its members by selling indulgences, something that takes the edge off of the torture of purgatory. Luther's movement against the church was highly controversial, but gained traction since other people also felt that the Catholics were not honoring God correctly anymore. The protesting groups that branched off during this time were called Protestants, because they protested. Get it? Great, moving on.
By the 1600s, there was a whole bunch of different Protestant communities ranging in beliefs and practices. Some remained very similar to Catholicism, and others abandoned many of the traditional elements. Enter George Fox to his tumultuous religious scene. He hopped, skipped, and jumped his way through organized religions, but he didn't find one he jived with. Fox believed God is the inner light within all of us, and that no clergy, sacraments, or ritual practice was at all necessary or appropriate. This idea is still central to Quakerism today. Fox and a group of his buds were eventually like, well, screw this, and began to practice religion on their own as a community of seekers.
This community set the example that would be continued into the practices of modern day. They were Christian in belief, but not in outward exercise. They didn't celebrate sacraments or recognize any clergy. All days were considered equally holy, just like all members were considered equals. The core belief of an inner light and a personal search for God guided all of their religious and political proceedings. They believed everyone had God inside them and everyone can reach him on their own path. These individuals began to call themselves friends from the Bible verse in John 15 that says, "I have called you friends." The term Quaker came about as a derogatory nickname since the Friends would quake during prayer meetings when filled with the Spirit. However, the name stuck and it's not considered offensive now. Side note, these are not to be confused with the Shakers, an even more radical branch of Quakerism that is no longer in existence.
Eventually, they moved to America like many Protestant groups at the time because new land means no religious persecution, right? Wrong. Since they were so different, the Quakers were still harassed for their beliefs in places like the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Regardless, a community still remained alive and supportive of one another. Quakers were unique in their involvement in government. They believed holy men and women should take an active part in public service. One of the greatest advocates of this and an influential figure in Quaker history is William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania. He set up this land to be a holy experiment of harmonious coexistence of natives, Quakers, and refugees from Europe. While it was never the heaven on earth Penn expected, Pennsylvania was still the best poor man's country in the New World, a place more inclusive and welcoming than any other area around.
Quakers remained an active part of the political and social affairs of this area until the later 1700s. At this time, they began to notice an incompatibility of beliefs and a sacrifice of tradition due to their heavy political involvements. To correct their own hypocrisy, the Quakers moved out of government and phased into a role more focused on social concerns. They became the first society to ban slaveholding and support the abolitionist movement. This spirit of philanthropy and pacifism remains an important part of Quakerism today. They still are involved in political movements for social reform, including events like rallies and protests for the spread of peace. It is intrinsic to the Quaker faith to care deeply about the community, and they practice this in both worship and in daily life.
Flash forward to present day, and most people think of oatmeal in Pennsylvania when they hear the word Quaker. They are perceived as stern and plain and almost seem non-existent in today's society. A quick glance at the Society of Friends will reveal that those perceptions are far from the reality of modern Quakerism. For starters, not every Quaker wears black all the time. In the past, many Quakers believed in what they called the testimony of simplicity. This teaches that Quakers are meant to live their lives as simply as possible so that they have more energy and time to devote to prayer and service. Part of this belief is that Quakers should dress simply and plainly, not only because there are more important things than clothes, but also because many of the Quakers saw fancy clothes as status symbols. People who dressed in finer clothes were richer and therefore above the rest of society. This goes against the central Quaker idea of everyone being equal. To combat this, Quakers dressed in clothes without frills or decorations. However, in today's world, it is hard to distinguish a Quaker from a non-Quaker based on dress alone. Most modern Quakers wear whatever they wish, although some of the more conservative members of the community will still dress plainly.
From the tradition of silence in Quaker meetings, a children's game arose in which everyone must remain silent. The game is started with a rhyme you may have heard. No more talking, no more fun. Quaker meeting has begun. If you show your teeth or tongue, you must pay a forfeit. The last person remaining quiet wins the game. Silence is an important part of worship, but this rhyme portrays modern Quakers as more strict and stiff than they really are.
A Quaker meeting starts when all the friends gather in the main room of the meeting house. This room is simple, without images of God or impractical decorations. Their worship starts with silence, as this is how they enter the presence of the divine spirit. A few minutes into the meeting, the clerk, who is an official who can be male or female, elected by a committee of members to serve for 3 years, stands and reads from scripture or other Quaker readings. A few minutes later, the children are dismissed to Sunday school programming. They break their meeting by shaking hands with the adults. After this, the meeting proper begins. Friends are invited to stand and bring a message to the community if they feel urged by the Spirit. Often these messages are passages of scripture or personal experience that can be applied to the rest of the community. After an hour, the clerk breaks the meeting by shaking hands with the people around him or her and greeting them. The friends will then greet those around them and gather together in another room for fellowship and to catch up with one another.
On a monthly basis, the friends gather after the meeting to conduct business. This entails budget updates and reports of what various committees within the community have been doing during the past month. During these meetings, all decisions are made in complete unison. This means that every single person must agree on a solution to an issue before it can be decided. If 2 solutions are presented and no one budges from their positions, a third solution must be reached so that the community is in complete agreement. This way, everyone gets a say and no one is excluded in the decision-making process. The downside to this method is that as the community gets larger, it is harder to make decisions since more voices means more dissent. However, the Quakers feel as though it is a necessary part of who they are, and they are willing to make the sacrifice of efficiency for full community involvement.
Like Quakers of the past, modern-day practitioners believe that every person is capable of accessing God without the help of an intermediary. Thus, Quaker communities have no clergy. Members of the community do not wish to have their pictures taken because they fear that they will become branded as a leader within the society, and they do not have ordained leaders. This can be quite a draw for new Quakers since no one is telling them what to believe or how to practice. They approach God or the Spirit in their own terms, in their own way, while being supported by a community of people who are striving towards the same goal.
Being a member of the Society of Friends is a serious decision that Quakers treat with respect and solemnity. There are 2 types of Quakers within the community: birthright Quakers and convinced Quakers. A birthright Quaker is someone who has been born into the faith and was raised by parents who practiced Quakerism. A convinced Quaker, on the other hand, is a convert, someone who has come upon the faith by themselves and decided that it was what they wanted to practice. If an individual is not a formal member of the community, they are called an attender. To become a full member, an attender must submit a formal request to a committee. The committee gathers and, after starting with worship, reviews the applicant and asks him questions about why he wants to be a part of the society. Individuals who feel called to worship as a member are rarely turned away.
Quakers firmly believe that being a friend is about much more than going to a meeting on Sunday. Quakers aim to live their daily lives in a way that exemplifies their faith. This sometimes means that some friends do not conduct big celebrations for holidays such as Easter and Christmas because every day is sacred and is a chance to live their faith. Quakerism fun fact: some Quakers will refrain from using the regular names for months and days of the week because of their roots in paganism. Thus, January, whose name comes from the Greek god Janus, is called first month, and Sunday, a name that comes from the Norse goddess Sunna, is called first day to avoid the connection with the pagan religions of the past.
Quakerism is and will continue to be a personal experience with the divine. It is a place for equals to share the presence of the Spirit with each other and form a loving and supportive community that advocates for peace and harmony in this troubled world.